How's it going, American History 2 students? Happy Friday. I'm going to get started with our Black History Month Person of the Day. This would have been shown back in February, but baby Harrison was born, so I couldn't finish this. Doing Ryan Coogler today. Y'all know I'm a big movie fan, so a lot of these are entertainment themed, sports themed. Not most of them's not politically themed or historically themed. He directed Fruitvale Station. He's the first African American to win the Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Film Festival. Those of you who don't know what that is a festival in Utah that's held every January. Probably won't be held this year because of COVID-19, but it gives a chance for up-and-coming filmmakers to make a name for themselves. And it's where a lot of filmmakers, like Spike Lee, like Kevin Smith, people like that, kind of break out, the Coen brothers. So it is a pretty awesome event. He also directed a film all y'all are familiar with in the MCU, Black Panther, only MCU film to ever be nominated for Best Picture. He directed Michael B. Jordan in Creed. Michael B. Jordan is in Fruitvale Station, and that is set in Oakland, and he is from Oakland, California. So that's Ryan Coogler. So let's go ahead and get into our warm-up for today. Today is day 149 of 180 of the regular school year numbering. It is COVID-19 shutdown day 23. This is your lesson for Friday, April 24th, 2020. Who were the Kwantung Army? They were the most elite fighting force within the IJA, Imperial Japanese Army. They were the ones who initially invaded Manchuria and set off the war in the Pacific. What day was Pearl Harbor attacked? December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, as FDR called it. What did FDR call Pearl Harbor? The day that will live in infamy. Coming from the word infamous. Infamous means to be famous for something negative, so Hitler is infamous. Pearl Harbor is an infamous day. 9/11 is an infamous day. So let's review these. The Kwantung Army, the most elite fighting force in the IJA. Pearl Harbor was attacked December 7th, 1941, and he called it a day, FDR did, that will live in infamy. Of course, that pulled America into World War II. Let's go ahead and get into our notes for today. This is American History 2, Unit 5, Part 1, which is World War II, and this is Section 5.4. We're going to focus on the major battles and the types of fighting and weaponry you saw in the Pacific Theater, which was a different beast than fighting in Europe altogether. In Europe, you're dealing with a lot of frigid conditions. Here, you're dealing with very hot conditions in the Pacific Theater. So, what defined the Pacific Theater? This is an overview of stuff we're going to talk about today. Douglas MacArthur, he was the overall commander for the Allied forces in the Pacific. Doolittle raids, our first strike against the Japanese post-Pearl Harbor. Bataan Death March was one of the worst atrocities committed toward American POWs, prisoners of war, in the history of warfare. Iwo Jima and Midway, two big battles that are going to be defined by aircraft carriers. And of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki is the only two times atomic bombs have been dropped, both by the United States. So, Doolittle Raid. This is a response to Pearl Harbor. It is an air raid on Tokyo. They actually bombed the Imperial Palace where Hirohito is at. Unfortunately, it does not wipe out Hirohito, although that could have been worse. It could have galvanized them behind him in the Shinto religion worse than they already were. This is a quick strike. It's not, as far as damage we do to the Japanese, that consequential, but it's important because it raises our morale following Pearl Harbor and shows that we can fight back against this type of enemy in Japan. So that was led by, named after Lieutenant Jimmy Doolittle. One of the most famous airstrikes, famous acts by the U.S. Air Force in American history. So you see these attacks are launched via aircraft carrier. Most of y'all know what that is. If you don't, it's a giant ship, and it allows us to deploy our Air Force through different spots in the Atlantic, Pacific, and other oceans, of course, if need be. So it is both a naval and an aerial vehicle. I want you to think about the capabilities of an aircraft carrier. It can not only shoot nuclear weapons, it can deploy the Air Force and is a traditional battleship as well. So there's a lot there. I believe currently the U.S. has 7 aircraft carriers, which is the most in the world. China is close with 2, going on 3. So this gives us, again, going back to Alfred T. Mahan and that strong Navy, military superiority compared to the rest of the world. The Battle of Coral Sea is the first battle between aircraft carriers. So this is a battle at sea, but by air, because the aircraft carriers are deploying their troops. You see kamikazes. I think I have that in here. I'm going to skip ahead. Kamikazes were a big part of these battles. Kamikazes are suicide pilots. The Japanese would take their planes, fly them into the aircraft carriers of the United States to do damage, and they were their logic was they would be rewarded in the afterlife because of their fight for the emperor and his divine power because of the Shinto religion. My daughter's trying to get in the room here. She's not having it. It's hard to teach with a toddler. A lot harder to teach with a toddler than teenagers in a high school classroom. So this is the first battle between aircraft carriers in the history of warfare. The U.S. is successful here because of code breakers. We are able to, it's a different type of code. So in Europe you have the Enigma Code. When I say code, this is the type of transcript they were using to communicate, the Japanese, and I don't mean their language, the kanji, as their symbols that make up the Japanese language are known as, but with this type of communication, you have it translated from our alphabet to the kanji, from the kanji to a secret code, and it was Navajo Indians who actually broke this code for the United States military because there were similarities identified between the code that they were using and some of the ancient tribal writings of the Navajo. It's really interesting stuff that despite all the bad things that the American government did toward various native groups, as you learned in American 1 and the beginning of American 2, the Navajo actually come up very big for America at this point in history. The Battle of Midway is the turning point of the War in Pacific. Stalingrad's still the overall turning point, but the code breakers basically set a trap for what was going to be a naval ambush. So they set a trap for the trap. The code breakers get wind of a massive attack that's coming from a different direction than the attacks had previously been coming from, and we actually spring a trap on them when they plan to ambush us. What famously happens here is the USA wins, but it loses its biggest aircraft carrier, the USS Yorktown. That was discovered 20, 30 years ago, and it was actually restored, and you can visit it as a historical site in Charleston, South Carolina today. Pretty cool if you ever go there. Here we're going to get into some of these other battles. Here we're going to talk about the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is one of the most famous battles throughout American history, but probably the most famous battle in the Pacific theater. You see that iconic image that is actually a monument in D.C. of the Americans lifting the American flag on the Iwo Jima Island. So why was this such a big deal during this war? 18,000 Japanese die, 7,000 Americans. So it's the bloodiest battle in the Pacific. This doesn't compare to like Stalingrad, where you have millions of dying. But what happens here is Iwo Jima was an island that, aside from the aircraft carriers, the Japanese were using to launch their aerial attacks. So it was a big strategic advantage. So when the U.S. is able to go in there, take over Iwo Jima, and take control of that entire island, even though a lot of the landing strips that the Air Force for Japan was using get damaged, they're able to rebuild them enough to launch air attacks from Iwo Jima. So they steal one of their biggest strategic advantages out from underneath them. So not only do you have the aircraft carriers where you can strike from, but you have the Iwo Jima Island that you can strike from as well. And the bigger thing is they don't have it. Okinawa. This is the definitive end to the war in the Pacific besides the atomic bombs. The definitive end as far as battles. So I guess it would probably be misleading to call it a definitive end. So it's a big victory because they're able to, you see the difference in the numbers of Japanese people, 70,000 to Allied forces, only 14,000. They're able to basically decimate the manpower that they had in the Pacific. This happens, the Battle of Okinawa is the last big island to fall, but also you have other things going on. Stalin has invaded China, and what you are about to have is the dropping of the atomic bombs. But let's talk about these islands and the strategies used in those real quick. Leapfrogging, or island hopping, was a strategy that General Douglas MacArthur implemented. Rather than going into Japan and the set of Japanese islands and trying to take them over all at once, let's take them over one at a time and launch attacks from each subsequent island. So you take over one island, then you can launch attacks from that island to the next, and so on and so on. Also have a goal strategically of the islands you want to capture, Iwo Jima being the main one, so you can use those airstrips. The Bataan Death March, this is where you had a lot of American POWs, prisoners of war, who were transferred. They were walking hundreds of miles in brutal heat. They were beaten on the way. This is early on during the conflict with the Pacific, and you see 10,000 die during that transportation. Some horrific things go on there via the Japanese soldiers, and kind of like the Nanking Massacre. I'll allow you to look that stuff up if that's something you find interesting. We talked about kamikazes. Operation Olympic. This was the final stand that Japan was going to have toward the United States and the Allies. So what that means is, since their manpower, their soldiers were decimated at Okinawa, what happens is Emperor Hirohito asked regular citizens to rise up. Women, children, civilians. They were literally sharpening bamboo sticks ready to attack the Americans. So Truman, who is president now because FDR has died of polio after he was reelected for an unprecedented fourth term, has a decision to make. I can launch these bombs, the atomic weapons, or I can send my people, the United States military, in to fight civilians. Now, would it be an easy win? Yeah. But what would be the cost as far as what he would be asking those American soldiers to do? So, ending the war in the Pacific. FDR dies of polio. Truman sworn in as president. He'll be elected to his own term after that. He wants to end the war, but he wants to do it without killing any more Americans, so he orders the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If we were in class, this is something I would spend an entire day on. So, let's hit the highlights here. Was it right to drop the atomic bombs? That's up for you to decide. Did a lot of innocent people die? Yes. Did it save a lot of American lives? Yes. You had people who were obliterated within the blink of an eye, and the nuclear shadows are still there to this day as they just evaporated. I encourage you, if this is something that interests you, that you look up the dropping of these bombs, because there is some video footage that's fairly decent that's been put out there. There was a race between Hitler and the United States to build the atomic bomb. The two main scientists who worked on it for the United States in a lab known as Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico were Robert Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein. You know Einstein, E=mc², one of the smartest human beings ever to walk the face of the earth. We beat Germany to an atomic bomb. The thinking was always that we would use the atomic bomb maybe on Germany, but that didn't end up being the case. Since the Japanese were so just devoted to their cause because they saw it as a religious one, they would not give up. So FDR drops a bomb on Hiroshima. Now, it is dropped by a guy named Thomas Farabee, and he is from Mocksville, North Carolina. He's the bombardier on the plane known as the Enola Gay that dropped that first atomic bomb. It was called Little Boy. Then later you would have Fat Boy that was dropped on Nagasaki. So not just one, but it takes 2 atomic bombs to get Japan to surrender. So Truman thinks after Hiroshima, this will all be over. No, they had to drop a second bomb, and that ends World War II. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they were a husband and wife team who worked at Los Alamos with Oppenheimer, with Einstein, and they were caught selling nuclear secrets to the Soviets. Of course, the Soviets will soon achieve nuclear capability after this, and that will define the next 50 years on what is known as the Cold War, which we'll talk about in part 2. They were charged with treason, and they were executed. VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. The war is over, September 2nd, 1945. This is where you have the famous kiss in New York between the sailor and the nurse. Some other highlights, the fighting in the North African theater in places like El Amin, places like Tunisia we didn't really cover. There was a lot of fighting over oil in the Suez Canal. This guy's name is General Erwin Rommel. His nickname's the Desert Fox. He actually betrays Adolf Hitler and switches sides in Africa, and he ends up being executed for that, but it still was a sign of bravery on his part to stand up and go against Hitler despite knowing the consequences. Leaders of World War II. Eisenhower, the leader of the D-Day attack, the D-Day landing. General George S. Patton led all the Allied forces in Europe. We didn't talk a ton about him, so he's a famous war hero, but actually ends up dying of a drinking and driving accident. He had a problem with alcohol abuse. MacArthur led the Allies in the Pacific. We talked about that. FDR is president. He's elected a 4th term, and he doesn't get to serve that 4th term because he dies of polio. Truman comes in, finishes the job, drops the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, on Monday, we'll come back and we'll talk about what was it like at home during the fighting of World War II and right after World War II. But that's going to do it for today's notes on 5.4, which is the fighting in the Pacific Theater. I hope that you guys have a good weekend and stay safe. Thank you so much for your dedication, and I hope to see you all soon. And I'm out.